And Zombie Reddit, today's story is...
My husband left me after 3 years of failed fertility treatments, only to discover after that he was the infertile one all along. Instant karma. I always thought that my husband Greg and I shared the same dream of starting a family. We were young, deeply in love, and full of hope for a future filled with children's laughter, little feet scurrying around the house, and all the hustle and bustle that comes with parenthood. During the early years of our marriage, everything seemed to fit together perfectly. We had achieved financial stability, we had just moved into a cozy house, and we started trying to conceive a baby. At first, everything was exciting, keeping track of my menstrual cycles, taking vitamin supplements, and imagining how we would break the news to our families. However, as the months turned into years, the hope that had kept us together began to feel like an increasingly heavy burden. After about a year of trying without success, we decided to seek medical help. Doctors' visits, blood tests, ultrasounds, and even uncomfortable conversations about Greg's reproductive health, to which he was always very defensive, became a regular part of our routine. Each medical appointment brought new recommendations and treatments to try. Every month we told ourselves that this would be the one, but it never was. The first few years were difficult, but we supported each other. When the test results were inconclusive, with nothing clearly wrong in my case, we clung to the idea that we simply needed more time. And that's when we started fertility treatments. I remember how invasive the whole process felt. The hormone injections, the constant monitoring, and the endless array of medications left me completely exhausted, both emotionally and physically. The treatments were expensive, but Greg insisted that we should spare no expense when it came to starting our family. I agreed because at the time I believed that we were both striving for the same dream. The first cycle of treatments failed, then the second, and then the third. Every time I saw a negative result, I felt as if I had been hit hard in the stomach. I constantly blamed myself, convinced that there was something wrong with me that the doctors simply couldn't detect. Greg began to distance himself during this time, although I tried to convince myself that it was simply his way of dealing with the situation. He stopped accompanying me to the medical appointments and became less and less enthusiastic when we talked about the next steps to take. One night, after another failed cycle, I broke down emotionally. As I sobbed in the kitchen, Greg simply watched me from the other side of the room. I confessed to him that I didn't know how much more I could bear this situation, and for the first time, he admitted that he was exhausted too. He told me he was tired of living by a strict schedule, of hoping for something that seemed impossible, and of seeing me torture myself emotionally and physically for a dream that seemed unattainable. His words hurt me deeply, but I understood. I told him I was willing to take a break from treatments if that's what we needed. I still wanted a baby, but I didn't want my marriage to be destroyed in the process. However, what Greg understood by a break was very different from what I thought. A few weeks later, he sat down in front of me and told me that he couldn't go on any longer. He didn't just want a break from the treatments, but a break from me, from us. He told me that he was tired of fighting what he called a war that we would always lose. He filed for divorce in less than a month. I was completely stunned. We had shared almost a decade together, and I thought we were facing this as a team. How could he just walk away from everything we had built, from the life we had imagined together? He explained to me that it wasn't just the fertility treatments. It was everything. He felt we were trapped in an endless cycle of disappointment and couldn't see a way out. Looking back, I think he was looking for someone to blame. He needed to hold someone responsible for his unhappiness, and I was the easiest target. In his mind, I was the one who couldn't give him what he wanted so badly, even though the doctors had never determined with certainty that the problem was exclusively mine. The divorce process was brutal, not only because of the emotional pain, but also because of the practical issues. We had spent tens of thousands of dollars on fertility treatments, and he made it very clear that he considered it all a waste. He didn't say it directly, but his change in attitude made it clear that he held me responsible. After the divorce papers were signed, I was left alone with my share of the savings and an enormous void in my heart. I had not only lost my husband, but also the future I had dreamed of for years. 4 months, I couldn't even look at a baby without experiencing a mixture of sadness and anger. But as time went by, I realized that I didn't miss Greg as much as I thought. The man I had married was kind, patient, and supportive, but the man I divorced had become bitter and distant. I missed the version of him that no longer existed, and that realization helped me begin to move on. The first year after the divorce was an emotional roller coaster. I felt completely devastated, as if I had failed not only Greg but also myself. The constant cycle of hope and disappointment of our fertility treatments had left scars that I wasn't sure would ever heal. I focused intensely on my career, taking on new challenges and reconnecting with passions that I had neglected during my marriage. My friends, who had been sidelined during my years of fertility obsession, quickly welcomed me back into their lives. They became my lifeline, reminding me that I was so much more than the label of infertile woman that I had worn like a badge of shame for so long. About 8 months after the divorce was final, I met Evan. He wasn't the kind of man I would normally have been interested in. While Greg had been intense and ambitious, Evan was calm, kind, and stable. He didn't have a dazzling career or a meticulously mapped-out plan for the next 5 years. Instead, he possessed a quiet confidence and a genuine interest in getting to know me for who I really was. At first, I was hesitant to let him into my life. My experience with Greg had left me wary of relationships, especially those that could lead to marriage or, God forbid, another emotional roller coaster of trying to start a family. But Evan was patient. He didn't pressure me to open up or to rush things. Gradually, I began to let my defenses down. Evan and I started spending more time together. We enjoyed dinners at cozy restaurants, walks in the fresh air, and quiet movie nights on a sofa. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years, and his calm presence helped me realize that I was still capable of loving and being loved. About 4 months into our relationship, something completely unexpected happened. I started to feel unwell. I experienced nausea, fatigue, and a strange aversion to my morning coffee. At first, I thought it was just stress or maybe a cold. But when the symptoms persisted, I decided to see my doctor. Sitting in the sterile examination room, I explained my symptoms to the doctor, half hoping he would attribute them to a virus or changes in my diet. Instead, he suggested I take a pregnancy test. I laughed nervously and told him that was impossible. After years of failed fertility treatments, I had accepted that pregnancy was not in my destiny. However, the test was positive. I looked at the doctor in disbelief, waiting for him to tell me there had been a mistake. When he didn't, I burst into tears, not only out of surprise, but also out of a deep and overwhelming feeling of joy. After everything I had been through, I was finally going to have the baby I had dreamed of for so long. Evan was as astonished as I was when I broke the news. He wrapped his arms around me, a huge smile lighting up his face, and told me that this was the best surprise he could have imagined. His enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel real hope. A follow-up appointment with my doctor confirmed that the pregnancy was healthy and progressing normally. It was during that visit that I asked a question that had been bothering me since the positive result. How was this possible when years of fertility treatments with Greg had failed? The doctor explained that sometimes stress and emotional tension could affect fertility, but then asked if Greg had ever undergone a comprehensive examination. I admitted that he had always resisted, insisting that the problem was not on his side. She nodded thoughtfully and mentioned that it was not unusual for couples to focus exclusively on the woman's fertility, even when male factors might be involved. This conversation stayed with me as I left the office. Could it be that Greg was the one with fertility problems all along? The possibility made my stomach churn. During our marriage, he had been so quick to blame me, so sure that I was the one responsible. I had spent years feeling broken by his words, only to discover now that the problem might never have been mine at all. Even so, I decided to focus on the present. Evan and I immersed ourselves in the preparations for the baby's arrival, transforming his spare room into a cozy nursery and reading books about parenting together. My parents and close friends were delighted when I shared the news, and their joy only increased mine. I had made it clear to Evan that, regardless of how recent our relationship was, I was determined to go ahead with this pregnancy. I made it clear that he would not have to take any responsibility in the future if he decided to leave now. But if he wanted to stay with me, with the baby, or with both of us, he could be completely honest with his feelings. After waiting for so long, this pregnancy was a real miracle for me. As the weeks went by, the memory of Greg lingered in the back of my mind. Part of me wanted to contact him and tell him about my pregnancy and the doctor's comments about the possibility of male infertility. Not to rub anything in his face, but to give him the opportunity to reflect on his actions and perhaps search for answers for himself. But another part of me wanted to keep this chapter of my life completely separate from him. In the end, I decided not to tell him anything. This pregnancy was my personal miracle, my new beginning, and I didn't want anything or anyone to cast a shadow over it. With each passing day, my excitement grew. The baby's first little kicks were like little reminders of how far I had come and all that I had overcome. However, I couldn't help wondering if Greg would eventually find out about the pregnancy through mutual friends or social media. And if he did, how would he react? Would he feel remorse for the way he had treated me? Or would he still be the same arrogant, self-centered man who walked away when things got tough? For now, I chose not to think about it. My attention was on the future, on the baby growing inside me, on the new life I was building with Evan, and on the happiness that had finally returned to my life. Update 1. The first indication that Greg had heard about my pregnancy came through a mutual friend. One night, while checking my messages, I noticed one from Sarah, a former colleague of Greg's with whom I had kept in touch. She congratulated me on the pregnancy, adding that Greg had contacted her, apparently looking for information about my new life. My stomach tightened immediately. It wasn't completely surprising, but I had hoped to keep him as far away as possible from this new chapter of my life. A week later, my phone started ringing. It was Greg. I answered out of idle curiosity. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as he asked if the rumors were true. Was I really pregnant? I calmly replied that I didn't consider it any of his business. But yes, I was indeed expecting a baby. There was a long silence, and then he burst out with accusations, saying that I had lied during our marriage. He claimed that I should have known all along that there was nothing wrong with my fertility, and that I had wasted years of his life and thousands of dollars on unnecessary treatments. His voice dripped with anger and disbelief as he insisted that I give him an explanation. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep my composure. I reminded him that I had undergone numerous tests during our marriage, and that every doctor we had consulted had focused on me because he had always refused to have any tests done. I added that my current pregnancy proved nothing more than the fact that circumstances had changed, and that perhaps it was time for him to take a closer look at his own health instead of jumping to conclusions. Greg scoffed, accusing me of avoiding the issue. He insisted that I had deceived him into believing that I was the problem and that I owed him answers. I told him I had nothing more to add and ended the call. Update 2. I thought that would be the end of it, but I should have known better. A few weeks later, Greg called again. This time, his tone was calmer. He admitted that he had seen a doctor and had undergone tests for the first time. The results, he told me, confirmed that he had a low sperm count and motility problems, factors that would have made conception almost impossible without advanced medical intervention. Hearing him admit it out loud should have been a relief, but instead it aroused a mixture of conflicting emotions. I struggled with the memory of the years I had spent blaming myself, the countless nights I had cried alone, and the way his impatience and anger had eroded my confidence. It was hard not to feel a surge of resentment, knowing that all that suffering could have been avoided if he had been willing to consider the possibility that he wasn't perfect. But Greg didn't call to apologize. Instead, he intensified his anger, telling me that I owed him all the money we had spent on fertility treatments during our marriage. He argued that since the problem had been his all along, the money had been wasted and I was responsible for repaying him. I was completely stunned. It was as if I couldn't see the irony of the situation. Not only had he refused to consider his own role in our fertility problems, but now he was trying to transfer the blame and the financial burden onto me. I explained that the treatments had been a joint decision, taken during our marriage when we both believed they were necessary. I reminded him that we had shared the emotional and financial costs in the same way that we had shared the hope of starting a family. If he now considered those treatments a waste, that was his problem, not mine. Greg did not take my refusal well. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, claiming that he had sacrificed a lot for me during our marriage, and that now I was enjoying the benefits without him. He even hinted that he might take legal action if I did not repay the $50,000 he claimed to have spent on his own. The conversation left me shocked, but I refused to let his threats dampen my happiness. I spoke to Evan about the incident that same evening, and he was as understanding as ever. He reminded me that Greg's behavior reflected his own insecurities and failures, not mine. Even so, I couldn't help feeling a nagging sense of frustration. Greg's inability to take responsibility for his actions had been a recurring theme in our marriage, and now he seemed determined to maintain that pattern in our post-divorce lives. Update 3. As you all know, Greg's harassment started subtly. First with a few emails and text messages repeating the same demand, that I repay the $50,000 he claimed I owed him for fertility treatments during our marriage. He insisted that, as the problem was not mine, I should take financial responsibility for what he now considered a waste of time and money. At first, I simply ignored him, hoping he would lose interest and move on with his life, but Greg was not the kind of person who gave up easily. Within days, his tone had changed from accusatory to downright threatening. He sent messages warning that if I didn't refund his money, he would take me to court. He claimed to have receipts and proof of every dollar spent, and he was prepared to expose me as a liar who had taken advantage of him. The threats upset me more than I wanted to admit, even though I knew that his claims had no legal basis. The idea of facing a legal battle while preparing for the arrival of my baby was overwhelming. I needed clarity and protection, so I contacted my lawyer, Helen, to ask for her advice. Helen listened patiently as I explained the situation, maintaining a calm demeanor throughout that contrasted sharply with my growing anxiety. She assured me that Greg had no solid argument for his claims. Fertility treatments, she explained, were a shared marital expense. It didn't matter who was ultimately responsible for the infertility. The decisions we made as a couple during our marriage were just that, joint decisions. Helen also pointed out that Greg's threats bordered on harassment. She advised me to start documenting everything. Every text message, email, voicemail, and social media post he sent me. If the situation continued to escalate, she said, we could consider sending a formal letter demanding that he cease this behavior. Her words calmed me, but they also rekindled a feeling of anger. For years, I had allowed Greg to control the narrative of our relationship, to make me feel insignificant and responsible for every problem we faced. This time, I wasn't going to let him bully me into submitting to his demands. The next time Greg sent me an email attaching screenshots of clinic and doctor receipts, I forwarded it directly to Helen. She drafted a forceful reply, reminding him that I was under no legal obligation to reimburse him for shared marital expenses and warning him to cease all contact immediately unless it was through the appropriate legal channels. Greg, of course, did not take the warning well. His emails became more erratic, accusing me of manipulating the system and threatening to ruin me if I did not give in to his demands. He even hinted that he might show up at my house to discuss the matter in person, which sent a chill down my spine. I spoke to Evan about everything that was happening, and his support was unwavering. He assured me that Greg's behavior was nothing more than the tantrum of a man who could not accept his own failures. Evan also suggested that we install a security system for our home, in case Greg decided to make good on his threat to show up unannounced. With Helen's help, I filed a police report to document the harassment. Although it did not result in immediate action from the authorities, having an official record of Greg's behavior provided me with some peace of mind. I also blocked his phone number and set up filters on my email to make sure his messages went directly to a folder I rarely checked. Despite all these precautions, Greg found new ways to intensify his harassment. He started contacting mutual friends and even some of my family members, spinning a sob story about how I had supposedly defrauded him of tens of thousands of dollars. He presented himself as the victim of a calculating ex-wife who had deliberately lied about her fertility in order to extract money from him. It was outrageous to hear the lies he was spreading, but I reminded myself that the people I really cared about, the ones who truly knew me, wouldn't believe his nonsense. And sure enough, many of the friends he tried to involve contacted me directly, offering their support and expressing their disbelief at Greg's behavior. One particularly outrageous moment occurred when my cousin Janet called to tell me that Greg had turned up uninvited to a family barbecue she was organizing and had spent the evening complaining about how I had ruined his life. Janet, who had never liked Greg to begin with, quickly asked him to leave and assured me that no one in the family took his accusations seriously. Even so, The constant drama was starting to get to me. I hated the idea that Greg's negativity was casting a shadow over my pregnancy, a time that should have been full of joy. Evan constantly reminded me to focus on the positive, pointing out that Greg's despair was a clear sign that I had regained control of my life. Helen finally sent Greg a formal cease and desist letter, warning him that any further attempts to contact me or involve third parties would result in legal action. She also reminded him that stalking was a serious crime and that his behavior could have consequences far more severe than he intended. The letter seemed to have an effect, at least temporarily. For several weeks there was blissful silence. No emails, no phone calls, no dramatic stories relayed by mutual friends. I began to breathe more easily, concentrating on preparing for the arrival of the baby and enjoying the peace that had been so lacking for so long. But Greg was not about to go away quietly. Just when I was beginning to think the storm had passed, he found a new angle. He sent a letter, this time through his own lawyer, stating that he was considering filing a lawsuit for emotional distress caused by my alleged cheating during our marriage. Helen laughed when she read the letter, dismissing it as a desperate attempt to frighten me into giving in to his demands. She assured me that the claim was completely without legal merit and advised me to continue to ignore Greg's antics unless he actually proceeded with a court filing, which she doubted he would do. Sure enough, the threat turned out to be completely empty. Greg had neither the resources nor the evidence to back up his claims, and, after a few more weeks of silence, it became clear that he had finally given up or at least retreated to lick his wounds. The experience was exhausting, but it also reinforced something I had learned over the last year. I was much stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. Greg's attempts to intimidate and manipulate me had failed because I refused to allow him to continue dictating the course of my life. Update 4. The questions started coming in soon after my last update, and I was overwhelmed by the response from all of you. Many were curious about the logistics of what had happened since the divorce, especially as it related to the house where I had lived with Greg. Some asked who got the property after the split. Others wanted to know where Evan and I were currently living. To clarify this point first, the house where I had lived with Greg was not really ours to claim. It belonged to his mother, my ex-mother-in-law. Greg and I had resided there as part of a long-term arrangement where his mother allowed us to stay rent-free as long as we took care of the maintenance and treated it as our own. It was never officially in either of our names. When Greg and I separated, the house didn't stay with either of us. Greg later tried to claim it as his, but technically he was just a tenant, not the owner. His mother, understandably, wanted to avoid complications and simply sold the property. It wasn't something I wanted to fight over, mainly because I knew I had no legal right to it. And emotionally, I was ready to get away from anything that reminded me of my failed marriage. As for where Evan and I live now, we are settled in Evan's house. It's a cozy place in a quiet neighborhood and represents a new beginning in every way. Evan had been living there for some time before we met, and that was one of the reasons why I felt so comfortable and secure moving in with him so quickly. He wasn't just offering me a place to live, but the security and stability I had longed for so long. Many of you were wondering how Greg knew where I was living now, especially considering that I had tried so hard to block any contact with him. It turns out that mutual friends and family had shared that information with him. It wasn't that I was broadcasting my new address, but some people, individuals who did not see Greg's actions as unreasonable, decided to pass that information on to him. It wasn't a big surprise, but it hurt to learn that my privacy had been violated by people who should have shown more sense. One of the most unexpected parts of this whole situation happened when my father contacted me. We hadn't spoken much in the years leading up to the divorce, and after everything that had happened with Greg, I expected him to be a source of comfort. However, when he found out about my relationship with Evan and my pregnancy, he started to express concerns. My father is not one to beat around the bush. He asked me directly if I was sure about this relationship with Evan, especially considering the pregnancy and everything that had happened with Greg. He told me that he didn't want me to rush into something just because I was desperate to start a family. I understood his concern, but at that moment I wasn't going to let his worries influence my decisions. I explained to him that I wasn't desperate to start a family. I was already building one. A healthy and supportive family with Evan, who cared for me in a way that Greg never had. I wasn't rushing into anything. I was embracing a new chapter in my life and finally doing it on my own terms. I assured him that I knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't trying to fill any void with Evan. This wasn't about desperation, but genuine love and real support. I could hear the concern in his tone of voice, but I also knew that I had to stand my ground. This was my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone dictate my decisions anymore. My father didn't reply immediately. After a long silence, he told me that he just wanted to prevent me from getting hurt again. He added that he didn't trust people like Evan, at least not right away. I understood his position perfectly. I had seen how Greg treated me, and I had witnessed the emotional roller coaster of our marriage, but I wasn't going to let that cloud my judgment about Evan. I told him that I sincerely appreciated his concern, but that I needed to live my own life. I had learned valuable lessons from the past, and I was not willing to make the same mistakes again. My father didn't say much after that, although I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. He still had his doubts and knew it would take time for him to adjust, but he also understood that this was my life and I should live it on my own terms, not his. My mother, on the other hand, was a little more understanding. She had been a pillar of strength for me throughout the divorce proceedings and knew how difficult the years with Greg had been. When I told her about Evan, she was happy for me, although she also expressed some concern about the timing of everything. She said she just didn't want me to feel too overwhelmed with so many changes happening at once. A pregnancy, a new relationship, it was a lot to handle, especially so soon after everything that had happened with Greg. I could completely understand her perspective. The timing certainly wasn't ideal, but I didn't feel overwhelmed at all. On the contrary, I was excited. I assured her that I wasn't rushing into anything. I had thought deeply about this decision. I wasn't facing this alone. Evan was completely by my side, and we were in this together. I mentioned to her that we had discussed the matter extensively beforehand. She did not press the matter further, although I could tell she was still keeping something to herself. It was just her way of protecting me, as she always had. It didn't bother me at all. It meant she really cared about my well-being. Despite the concerns expressed by both my father and mother, I couldn't help feeling that I was finally on the right track. Yes, everything had changed dramatically in the blink of an eye, and yes, the circumstances were far from ideal, but this was definitely my new beginning, and I was determined to make the most of it.